Welcome back to Mosa Metrics. I'm Pratika Masani, and in this video we're going to look into how to incorporate the framework that we created in the previous video into one of the notebooks. So this is the framework that we created. Let's give it a name. So this helped us to initialize the lake house that we wanted to work with. So we do need to know this lake house and all the information related to that. So I'm going to go back to my ingestion folder and use one of the notebook which are actually a bit easy. So probably I'll go to world data because there is not a lot happening in this notebook. So it's easy to understand how we could incorporate the framework into this notebook. If I quickly go back to the login framework and look into one of the sample row that we created. So this is the sample row that we created. If I copy this to this notebook and look into, let me just comment it. So what I need is I need my notebook name. I need the table where I'm inserting that data into. I also need to understand where I should keep my data. So where is my lake house? Where is my monitoring lake house? And there are a few other things like, the things around some stats and also who is the user, what kind of operation that's happening, how long the operation took, if there are any messages like, error messages or any manual messages that I wanted to include. So these are the various parameters I am providing so it can get inserted into my logging table. I need a way to capture all this information as part of this notebook. The first thing I need is where is my lake house, my monitoring lake house. Again, we could go back and use the Senpai and get the workspace ID and all those things, or we could manually provide this information. And we could also parameterize this cell so that when we're putting it in for the orchestration, you could specify this information. So this is where my lake house, this is the lake house name, and then I have my workspace ID where my lake house, my monitoring lake house is, and also my lake house ID. The other things I would probably need is the various libraries that I would need. So these are the libraries that's already there. So I'm gonna remove them. Actually, not yet. Let's just keep them for now. I'll come back to this in a bit. So let me just execute that cell, and we could go back to that in a sec. And we also need some logging variables. So for example, getting the notebook name. So we could get the notebook name by using the Fabric Senpai and get artifact ID. So that provides me the notebook ID. And then I could also get a user, who is the user that's logging. I could use get pass and get the user, and I could also get the logging save path. It's pretty much happening in the same way. So when we go back to the logging framework, we were mounting the lake house and then getting that information. And here what I'm doing is I'm just providing the logging workspace ID and also logging lake house ID. The next thing that I also need is to be able to capture the row count and all those things. So for that, I'm going to define a few functions. It's basically bringing it from our logging framework. So I need log changes and also save log data frames. So I'm just going to copy this over here. Another function that I need is to be able to get the row count. It's a very simple function. What I'm doing is I'm checking if the table exists. If the table exists, get me the row count of that table. And that's kind of what's happening. And to check if the table exists, I have another function which is doing that thing. So let me define that function first. So the checking the table exists is again very simple. It's checking, we are providing the table path. It's taking the table path as a parameter, and it's checking if the table exists at that location that we provided. If the table doesn't exist, it's giving me an exception saying table doesn't exist and whatever the exception that comes back. And then I'm using that function over here to see if the table exists or not. I could combine them into one function, but I think I could use this table exist for in many other places as well, so that's why I kept it as a separate function. So these are I'm gonna quickly execute all these code blocks. I need to define these variables, and then I could execute this, and that would work. So this is my main code block where I am calling the API and getting the data and putting the data into Lakehouse. So I'm going to move this code block all the way to over here. And this is where I want to incorporate logging framework. So for that, let's understand what's happening in this one quickly. So I am importing some libraries and I am finding out how many pages are there, and then I'm looping the data within the for loop to be able to get all the pages in this one. And then finally I am putting all that into a Spark data frame and am making a few changes if there are any spaces in the column names with underscores. And then finally this is where I'm writing the data. So all this code that has been already been happening, this could just stay as it is, because that's basically calling the API, getting the data, and finally I have all my data in one data frame. So whatever the logging that I wanted to do, I wanted to do it afterwards. So if we go back and figure out what are the various columns that we need, if I go back to my logging framework, so this is the structure of my table. I have the rows before, rows after, and the type of operation, messages, and the timestamp and all those things. Timestamp is kind of happening within the function. So these are the various columns that I need. For that, I'm going to start by providing some of the information as variables. And so to begin with, I have the table name, which I already have, and then I'm checking my operation type. So this is the operation type for this table. I'm just overwriting the existing data in my Delta table. And then I'm also getting like a workspace ID. I'm also getting the workspace name. I'm also getting Lakehouse ID. I'm also getting the Lakehouse name. So that helps me to create this variable about destination save path. This is basically where I'm writing my data. And why I want that is just because I want to get rows before. So by using the get destination save path, I could go and get the rows before I start my operation, before I insert more data into it. And the rows before is using the function getRowCount, and that is the function that we created previously over here, this one. All right, going back. Next, I'm going to use the start time. So this start time is an interesting thing. Like, you could keep it at different places. It's kind of like, what is that you want to capture? Like, what is your start time? Do you want to capture it at the beginning of your notebook? Or do you want to capture it like, when you made your first call to your API? Or like, where you want to capture it is interesting. In this case, I'm capturing it here, but probably it doesn't really make sense capturing it here. Probably I would actually capture it in the beginning of when I do my API call. But for now, it's okay. Let's just keep it there. And then I want to basically write data into my Lakehouse with all the information that I already have. So this is how we were writing data into the Lakehouse previously. So instead of doing it that way, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put the data into a try and except block so that I can do the error handling. It's exactly the same code that I was using previously, except I kept it in a try block and the except block so that I could capture the exceptions. So I'm going to delete row 56 because I have that in row 46. So what it's doing is, this line we already know, it's basically writing the data into my destination. And afterwards, row 47, it's basically checking what is the row count once we inserted the new data. Well, in this case, I'm overwriting the data, so it helps me to understand what was the row count, like if there are any new rows. And then I'm also getting the number of rows inserted. Basically, I'm counting the data frame that's over here, and I'm checking, like, how many rows. And then I'm just putting a little message saying data loaded successfully, and if there are any exceptions, the message would be my exception, and the end time is the time once this whole process is done, and the execution time is just a combination, it's subtraction of end time and the start time. So, and then finally what I'm going to have is, now I inserted data into my lakehouse, but however I captured a lot of information while I was doing that operation. So now I finally have to capture all that information and put that into my logging table. So that's basically what's happening in this piece of code. Again, I'm using the try and except. That's the wrong copy and paste. So this is the one. It's basically what we were doing previously, where we were using the log changes function to log data into the lakehouse monitoring table, except instead of giving some static values that we given in our sample row, in this case I'm actually giving all those variables that I created so far, and it's basically inserting all that time, all those variables into my logging table. And again, we have some extra statements here, print statements and things like that. So if you're executing in the notebook, you still have some information displaying, like, what's happening within the notebook. So now let's execute this and see what happens. And there is no data. And that's because I gave wrong workspace IDs and wrong workspace name. So if I go back here, I think this is why it is useful to make sure, like, if we get the workspace ID and workspace name programmatically, then giving like this. But however, I gave it wrong, so let me just fix that. Right, if I updated my lakehouse IDs and things, and if I re-execute this, so that I executed successfully, and if I go and see the data in my lakehouse, my SQL Analytics endpoint view, and when I execute my monitoring log, I could see I have my sample row, and I also have a new row, which is basically giving me notebook name, table name, rows of before, after, and the number of rows inserted, because it's just a static data, so that's why it's the same. And it's giving me the who ran, because I'm executing it from the notebook, that's why I have the trusted service user. And the operation type, it's the static value that I provided, how long it took, and there is no error message, but I have a general message saying it's been successfully loaded, and also it's giving me when it happened. I mean, I probably doesn't need like a full timestamp. I could probably make it smaller for the data saving purposes, but you get the idea of what we could do. So if I just go back and reiterate what's going on in this entire notebook, just so that we all understand it, I'm going to delete this. So first I'm installing the libraries that I needed for my notebook. So these are the libraries I would probably need for everywhere wherever I'm using my framework, and I could probably exclude a few things, but these are the libraries that I would be using in every notebook where I run the framework. And then I have some information that I need to provide. For example, where is my logging lakehouse, which workspace my logging lakehouse exists, and what is my logging lakehouse ID. So that's kind of what I'm giving here. And then I have various functions that are needed to be able to use this framework. So instead of keeping them in a separate cells, I could just keep all of them in one cell and probably give a markdown and change this into heading 2. So this is where all my functions are. And then what I'm doing is I'm providing some variables that's needed for my notebook. So these are basically the logging variables that I needed. So these are the various logging variables that I need, and this is where my main block is happening. And this inside the code block, I'm basically calling the API, but however, this is the piece of code where I am doing most of the operations that's needed for capturing. So to begin with, I am providing what are the various operations that's happening, like, what kind of operation I'm working with, where is my destination table, where is the workspace, what is the workspace name, what is the lakehouse, what is the lakehouse name, and where is my destination path, where am I inserting my data into, so that I could go and do the row counting. If I'm not doing the row counting, this whole information is not needed. And why I'm getting the IDs and names and everything is to be for this destination path. Now it's working with the ID, like in a few weeks ago or months ago, there was a tiny bit of a period where it was not working with ID, and when I had to use the name, and that's why I was bringing the name as well. But to be honest, because we don't need that anymore, we could just remove the names from the code. It's not really needed. And then I am basically printing some destination path. So what's happening here is we are counting the rows, we are capturing the start time, and this is where basically we are inserting our data that we got from API into a delta table, and then this is where I'm inserting the data into logging table. And once I have my data into the logging table, I could go and see what happened. And imagine I'm doing this for my entire API for every city that I'm running. Then I should be able to go and see how many rows has been inserted, what changes has been, and how many new rows are coming. And I don't have to go and do it checking my entire logs and everything, because I'm more focused in one solution. I could just go to this one table and get an understanding what's happening within my solution. If I went a bit too fast, and if there is something that is confusing, there is a blog attached in the comments. Go and check out the blog, and you'll have these notebooks available there as well, so you could go and start playing with creating your own framework. And let me know if you like it, or if you want to make some changes to it, or if you're what kind of information that you would like to capture in your logging framework. Thank you, and I will see you in our next video.